Hello and welcome back to our seminar on Shakespeare. Today I want to discuss Romeo and Juliet. And first of all, before you start the video lecture, please, as usual, try to create an overview of the play's characters and the play's plot by yourself. This will help you to understand the play better. So please pause the video now, create an overview of the play's characters and the play's plot as far as you have understood it, and then please continue with the video lecture. If we look at the characters in the play Romeo and Juliet, we see, similar to King Lear, a parallel character constellation. But please beware, there is no parallel plot. It's only a parallel character constellation. We have the two families, Montague and Capulet. And if you have a closer look, you see we have Romeo and Juliet, members of the two families. And then we have on both sides the parents, and we have some relative, Benvolio on the one hand and Tybalt on the other hand. We also have a few other characters, Mercutio on the one hand and the nurse and the Count Paris on the other hand. And somehow in between these two families and these two groups of characters, we have the friar and we have the prince. As I said, they are somehow in between, negotiating between the two groups. If we look at the plot, the basic structure of the plot is the quarrel between the two families, Montague and Capulet. So two groups of characters that oppose each other. Romeo and Juliet, the two young characters, they meet and they fall in love, or they claim to fall in love. We will come back to that later. Even though one of them belongs to one of the families and the other one belongs to the other family. And even though they belong to the two different families, their plan is to marry. Okay, so Romeo and Juliet are secretly married by the friar. But the problem is that this quarrel between the two families overshadows their future. So their future, it becomes clear in the play, is probably very difficult. They face problems instantly. As I said, the quarrel overshadows the whole play, not only their future. And in one of the encounters between the two families, Romeo kills Tybalt, and he is, as a consequence, banished from Verona by the prince. Against this background, the friar develops a plan according to which, first of all, Juliet is to take poison that will put her in a state of seeming death. Secondly, her family will bury her in the family tomb. And thirdly, Romeo is to take her with him once she awoke. The problem is that this plan miscarries because the friar failed to inform Romeo. So he should actually have made sure that Romeo is informed, but he didn't do that carefully enough. This is another thing that we will come back to soon. And the results are, of course, a disaster. The results are that Romeo assumes that Juliet is dead and kills himself, and then Juliet awakes. She discovers that Romeo is dead, and then she kills herself. And only after the death of their two children, the two families finally make peace, when it is too late. And I would say that's more or less the basic structure of the plot of Romeo and Juliet. Okay, let's have a look at the genre of tragedy. Romeo and Juliet is one of Shakespeare's most famous tragedies, and we have already discussed the genre of tragedy when we discussed King Lear, but I would like you to have a pause now, pause the video, And please try to remember the different concepts of the term tragedy that we have discussed in the context of King Lear. If you can't remember in detail, please check your notes, and afterwards please continue with the lesson. When we discussed King Lear, we said a very simple definition of tragedy is a play that is full of disastrous events. The situation turns from good to bad, and tragedies have a sorrowful ending. But of course, this is a very, very simple definition of tragedy. So there are, of course, more advanced definitions, and they are based on three different concepts. The first concept is the fall of the mighty. So we have a powerful character such as a king, and this character loses his previously high position. That's the first idea. So a king, for example, who is in a powerful position, and as is the case with King Lear, for example, this character loses his position. And in the end, frequently this character dies. The second concept is the inescapable workings of destiny. So the idea here is that it is simply fate that makes the characters suffer. The characters cannot escape their fate. Fate or fortune. The third concept is based on the idea of misjudgment in the face of an exceptional situation. So the protagonist commits errors when faced with extraordinary problems. These are the three basic concepts of tragedy. So the question now is, of course, when we look at Romeo and Juliet, which of these concepts is dominant in the play? And what I want to do now is I want to have a look at some of the passages of the play in order to find out. Let's first of all have a look at a passage in the first act. I hope you remember that this means act, and this means scene, and this means the lines. So first act, fourth scene, line 107 to 112. And Romeo speaks. What does he say? He refers to some consequence yet hanging in the stars. He that hath control of my course will lead, or this will lead to an untimely so early death. This is basically what he says. Of course, I summarized now this rather long passage. So, what does he actually say? In this foreshadowing, what is foreshadowing? Foreshadowing means he looks pessimistically into the future. So in this foreshadowing, Romeo refers to some power beyond his control. He refers to fate, or alternatively, we can also say to love. So when he says he that has control of my course, it could be fate or love. And he assumes that this power will influence his destiny, his fate. And this will cause his early death. So what becomes clear in this passage is the concept of tragedy as fate. But this is not the end of the story. Let's have a look at another passage when the friar talks to Juliet in the fourth act. He talks about a liquor, which is basically some kind of medicine that she should drink, and then she would appear like death, and Romeo should be informed by letter. What we can see in this passage is, I would say, a serious misjudgment on the part of the friar. Okay, yes, they are in a difficult and unusual situation and they need a proper solution. But what the friar does is thoughtless. He does not make sure that Romeo really receives all necessary information. In such a situation, sending a letter is certainly not enough. So the friar simply underestimates the situation and the potential risks of the situation. Okay, what happens next? In the fifth act, the friar talks about unhappy fortune, or he refers to a greater power than we can contradict has prevented our plans. What does he say? What we see here and what he says is what Edmund in King Lear refers to as evasion. So he is avoiding the problem and he's avoiding responsibility. Or in other words, the friar refers to fortune or to a greater power in order to find an excuse for his mistakes. So I think it should become clear that the dominant concept of tragedy in Romeo and Juliet is not based on destiny and rather on the concept of poor judgment. Another quote, by the way, poor judgment, another quote from King Lear. The dominant concept of tragedy is not based on destiny but on poor judgment. And this also becomes clear in the next and last passage that I want to quote. When Romeo dies, he says, "Here's to my love, and thus with a kiss I die." What we see here is another grave misjudgment, this time on the part of Romeo. Because he doesn't, a few lines before that he says, Juliet doesn't look dead. But he doesn't consider anything anymore, he simply drinks and dies. But of course, what he does in the end is the result of a series of misjudgments in the course of the play. By the friar and by Juliet, who do not consider the risks of their plan, but also by Capulet, the father of Juliet, who simply underestimates his daughter's determination not to marry Paris. He insists, she refuses, and he doesn't pay attention. So there were a lot of, let's say, errors in judgment in the course of the play, and in the end, what is the result? Several characters are dead, and amongst them Juliet and Romeo. So let's summarize. As is the case with King Lear, some of the characters repeatedly refer to destiny. But on closer examination, the reasons for their disastrous ending and for the disastrous ending of the play, the reasons are errors in judgment. Again, as is the case in King Lear. Characters do not sufficiently reflect on their actions and the consequences, potential consequences of their actions. Parents refuse to listen to their children. And so it is not fate or fortune that causes the death of the two young lovers, but the errors committed by several of the characters. But I mentioned three concepts at the beginning. What I have not referred to so far is fall of the mighty. Why? Because we said it's not so important in King Lear. Yes, of course, we have the fall of the king, but it's not the basic concept. And it is even less relevant in this play, Romeo and Juliet, because simply we don't have characters of the required social status. We don't have kings. We have two more or less average families. So there cannot really be a fall of the mighty or fall of mighty characters because we don't have such mighty characters in the play. Apart from the prince maybe, of course, but the prince is not in the center of the action. Okay, we have discussed ideas and concepts of tragedy. But Romeo and Juliet is famous as a love story. So what we should and have to talk about is the topic of love in Romeo and Juliet. Okay, let's start with one common idea. Romeo and Juliet is commonly seen as celebrating true love. The question now is, what does true love actually mean? And do you think that the play Romeo and Juliet is showing us the concept of true love, or is the play critical of this concept? So again, a task for you. Please think about these two questions. Pause the video and think about the question, what does true love mean? What do you think true love is? And what do you think does the play Romeo and Juliet show us this concept? Does it celebrate this concept? Is it positive towards this concept? Or is the play rather critical of this concept? So please pause now, think about that. Please also take notes, because this will help you to organize your thoughts. And after having done this, please continue with the lesson. Okay, let me just try to give you some ideas what I think is commonly associated with the concept of true love. There are things like eternal love, so love forever, loving forever, or love at first sight. This basically means you see someone for the first time and in the first 2-3 seconds you fall in love forever. There's an idea like love is unique. So I'm the only one that feels like that. No one can feel as strongly as I do. No one else can feel like that. Or the idea love is perfect. And my love is perfect. Or the person I love is perfect. Everything is perfect. There's also something associated with the concept of true love, something that I called absolute and unlimited love for someone. So loving without restrictions and unconditionally. Or maybe even loving someone for his or her individual character, disregarding outer appearance. But my thesis is, and thesis means point, my point is the concept of true love is very problematic, and the play Romeo and Juliet is critical of this concept. I repeat, this concept of true love is problematic. It's a problematic concept. And the play Romeo and Juliet is very critical of this concept. I know this might come as a surprise, especially the second part of my thesis, but let's see. Okay, first of all, the idea of true love is problematic. Why? How can we, for example, promise someone eternal love? No one can look into the future. Feelings might change. What do we know what we will feel in 20, 30 or 40 years? Love is never perfect. There's always something that we might not like about another person. That doesn't mean that there is nothing like love, no such thing like love, or that we cannot love someone. But nothing is perfect, no one is perfect. Love is not about perfection. The problem, however, is love is a very strong feeling. This is why we tend to use superlatives when we describe it. And we tend to use, this is important, we tend to use terms that we know from literature and from films. So we are frequently not expressing what we feel. We don't really listen to ourselves. We don't feel or try to feel what we feel, and we don't try to express what we feel. We rather do and say what literary texts and films tell us to do or say. I repeat. When we talk about love, when we try to express our feelings, frequently what we might be tempted to do, let's say like that, is to use terms that we know from literature and from films, and behavior maybe we know from literature and films. And then we knowingly, or in most cases I guess unknowingly, use terms that we know from literature and films, and we behave in ways that we know from literature and films. This, as I said, this does not mean that there are no strong feelings. There is no such thing like love. This is not my point. The point is, or the question is, how do we express this? And frequently, this is the argument here, frequently we use terms and we apply behavior that we know from something that we have seen a film or read a book. Okay, in this context, I would like you to have a look at William Shakespeare's Sonnet 130. I hope you remember that we discussed that in our introduction to literature, but I guess you might not remember all the details, so please now again pause the video, take your time, read this, try to remember, try to understand, and then please continue with the lecture. And maybe ask yourself the question, why, not only what is it all about, but why is it important in this context? Okay, what is this poem all about? The poem, the sonnet, discusses love and the way we talk about love. More specifically, how we describe a woman in love poetry. This poem, this sonnet, criticizes stereotypical descriptions of women that disrespect their individuality, so it criticizes the blazon. Maybe you remember, the blazon is a catalogue or a list of stereotypical terms and images used to describe a woman in love poetry. And I just said the poem criticizes such descriptions, such catalogues, such a list. Most importantly, it uses the term false compare. So it basically points to the fact that if we use such terms, we apply false comparison. So the lyric I, the speaker, cannot express his own feelings. At the end, the poem refers to my love as rare. The lyric I cannot express his own feelings by using conventional words from literature or films. Let's just go back for a second. If you look at the poem, what is this blazon in the poem and where is the criticism? The poem talks about certain, let's say, characteristics, and it uses items from this catalogue, from this list, in order to point out that they do actually not apply. For example, he says, my lady's eyes do not look like the sun. Her lips are not red. Her skin is not white. And her hair is certainly not soft. It's rather like wires, etc., etc. Her breath, for example, is not agreeable. Her voice is certainly not like music. But, this is what I've already said, in the last two lines, the lyric I says, yes, but this is false compare, so I compare wrongly. I shouldn't compare like that. My love is very individual. I love her strongly, but I cannot express this in such wrong terms. This is the basic idea. So this is what I've just discussed. So the poem criticizes the blazon, and if we look at Romeo and Juliet, because the question is now, of course, why did I discuss the Sonnet 130? That's actually not our topic right now. We're talking about Romeo and Juliet. Yes, why did I do that? We can see that in Romeo and Juliet, the two young lovers try to realize the idea of true love. For example, we have the idea of love at first sight. In the first act, when they meet, they immediately claim to fall in love. Or, and this is why the sonnet was relevant, they use very conventional phrases in order to express their love. In this fifth scene of the first act, they idealize love by talking about it in religious terms. Romeo refers to Juliet, for example, as holy shrine. He talks about despair if she should not immediately respond to his kiss, etc., etc. So the sonnet was relevant in our context because what we see is that both the young characters tend to use conventional phrases, just as the sonnet said we should actually not do. Okay, now the sonnet refers more to the description of a woman. In Romeo and Juliet, it's more about a general idea about love and how we express love, but nevertheless, it is both, in both cases, it is about how we talk about it and what it is that we refer to. And in both cases, it's about conventional terms, very often terms from literature that we refer to. Terms, phrases, images, behavior that we know from things that we have read, or nowadays, of course, that we have seen in films, for example. Okay, so, but I said, don't forget the point right now. What I said is the two young characters try to realize the idea of true love. As I said at the beginning, they celebrate this idea of love at first sight. It only takes a few lines and they claim to be fully in love with each other. They use these conventional phrases. This is why the sonnet was relevant. And they live according to the idea of absolute love. So they claim they cannot live without each other and they commit suicide in the end because they say if one of us is dead, the other one cannot live. And this is a very common literary topic. Okay, don't forget the point right now. Romeo and Juliet, in this play, we have two young characters that try to realize this idea of true love. But what I would say is that the play criticizes, the play as a whole, criticizes the concept of true love. So the play shows us, for example, that the two young characters only live what they have learned about love. They behave as they assume it should be. One example, Romeo's melancholic, so depressed behavior at the beginning. I hope you remember when his friends talk about him and say, what is it? Where's Romeo? Etc. etc. And they say, he's sad. He's walking somewhere in the woods, feeling lonely, sad. He's sad about some woman, etc. etc. Romeo behaves exactly as a young lover in a love story or in a poem is supposed to behave if he's unhappily in love. But the point is that soon after he totally forgets about his first love, Rosalind. I guess you have even forgotten her name. He totally forgets about his first love, Rosalind, and immediately falls in love with Juliet. And this, of course, questions the whole idea of absolute and eternal love. If he can basically change from one to the next within a few lines only in the play. But there's another example where you see that the concept of true love is criticized in the play or questioned in the play. The way the two young characters express their feelings is full of exaggerations, especially when we consider that they have known each other for only a few days. So the point here is they are unable to express any feelings in their own words. They simply refer to what they think is appropriate now. They simply talk and behave in a way they think this is appropriate. So again, let's repeat. What we see in the play is, of course, two characters that try to live the idea of true love, Juliet and Romeo. But the play as a whole is rather critical of this. And I mentioned a few arguments. We see that they try to live this, but we see it seems like they only assume this is how it should be, so let's do it like that. At the beginning, for example, Romeo, how he behaves, he follows the kind of a script. Just think about a script, an actor that plays or has to learn, first of all, a script for a film or for the theater. And it seems as if Romeo has learned such a script. Unknowingly, of course. He doesn't know what he's doing, but he seems to have learned such a script like a role that he learned for the theatre. Now he plays the lover, maybe the unhappy lover. This is what he's learned, and this is how he behaves. Or the way they talk about it, it's full of, as I said, exaggerations. They seem to use phrases. They seem to behave in ways that they have learned, again, just like a script they have learned. This time it is a script, not for a film, not for the theatre, but a script kind of for everyday life, but similar to the theatre, how a lover is supposed to behave, how someone that is in love is supposed to behave. But there is more to this criticism. One very important element of criticism is related to time. Just consider, it takes only a few minutes in the play for the two characters to fall in love. And this questions the whole idea of them being in love. Because to develop such a strong feeling needs time. You can't say after 2 minutes, after 25 or I don't know, 50 lines in a play, after a few minutes only on such a party, that you are fully and eternally in love with someone. So this is of course questioning the whole idea. But it's still about time. The question is, can we actually imagine Romeo and Juliet, the two characters, as an old and quarreling couple? And the answer is of course not. So this means that they have to die in order to create the literary image of eternal love. So only because their love lasts such a short time can such an image of eternal love develop. And only because of this can the play Romeo and Juliet become famous as the love story most people imagine it is. Let me repeat this point. I said criticism in the play is strongly related to time. What does that mean? Let's focus on the second point I just made. Thinking about Romeo and Juliet as an old and quarreling couple. And this of course would destroy the whole image. So we cannot imagine Romeo and Juliet as an old and quarreling couple. So they have to die so that the idea of eternal love can be created. But what kind of eternal love is that if it's so short? So I hope you understand the contradiction in that. Only because their love lasts such a short time, we remember them as the young couple that will be eternally in love. But again, what kind of eternal love is that if it lasts for 4 days or 5 days, something like that? Yes, so let's recap on that. Criticism in the play is related to time. The fact that they only need a few minutes in order to claim to be eternally in love questions the whole idea of being in love and being eternally in love. As I said, this needs time to develop. And the next thing is, what kind of eternal love is that if it lasts such a short time? But this is the condition that the play can survive as the famous love story everybody knows nowadays, or thinks to know nowadays. Okay, so basically what I will do now is a very short summary of the topic of love in Romeo and Juliet. Because if we summarize what we've said so far, we see there are two basic interpretations of love in this play. The first one is the play Romeo and Juliet celebrates true and romantic love. This is the first interpretation. Again, the play Romeo and Juliet celebrates true and romantic love. What are the arguments for this? Of course, this is not my position. I think this should have become clear now. But nevertheless, let's try to make this position as strong as possible. So what are the arguments for that? The play shows us the intense passion. What does that mean? Strong emotion. So the play shows us strong emotion, intense passion that exists between Juliet and Romeo. The two young lovers are prepared to do everything for their love. They are even prepared to commit suicide for their love. Love is, of course, the main topic of the play, and Romeo and Juliet is altogether one of the most famous love stories of all time. Okay, I now really tried my best to make this position as strong as possible, even though it's not my position. Now let's look at the second interpretation of love in this play. What is the second position or interpretation? The play Romeo and Juliet is critical of the idea of true and romantic love. What are the arguments or reasons for this position? Of course, this is my position, and I will now, of course, try to make it as strong as possible as well. One argument is that the two young characters only play the role of lovers. I think I have discussed that in detail. They do this, and that's the point, they do this according to ideas they have learned and read about. Their love can only be eternal because they die so young, which of course questions the whole idea of eternal love. Romeo's change of attitude from Rosalind to Juliet questions the whole concept of eternal or absolute love. What kind of eternal love is that if he can change so easily? And the last point, I think this is a very strong argument. Juliet and Romeo only project the ideas they have learned about love onto each other. Let me try to explain what I mean. They project means they kind of stick it onto the other person. So Romeo serves as a kind of projection for Juliet, and Juliet serves as a kind of projection for Romeo. And they try to find someone, it could be anyone. They try to find someone where they can simply stick their ideas of what they have learned about love. Now, Romeo happens to find Juliet. Rosalind, it didn't work, she was not interested. Okay, at some point he turned to Juliet. Now Juliet was there, he just projected his ideas of love onto her. It could have been someone else. For Juliet, it's the same. We could even argue, if she had met Paris before Romeo, before having met Romeo, and if she had been in the right disposition for that, she might have fallen in love with him. Now it happens to be Romeo, but it seems as if this is not so important. You might say, no, it's not like that, but then please just consider Romeo's change of attitude. This is a strong point. But let me come to the end now. I leave it to you what you think. I try to make both positions as strong as possible. Maybe you have even more arguments for the first interpretation or for the second one. That doesn't matter. Think about it yourself. I leave it to you. Think which interpretation is more convincing to you. I will not try to convince you. I simply prepared two interpretations or presented two interpretations. The rest is up to you. Think about it. Come to a conclusion. That's the basic idea of our seminar. You should learn to develop your own ideas. So what I do is I present, and you can decide which of the positions is more convincing to you. Okay, thanks for watching, and we will soon be back with another video, then on Shakespeare's Richard III.